This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the colorman was retired, the three-quarter was missing, and the client was illustrious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered why Sherlock Holmes had 3 different colored dressing gowns? Or what a Crockford is?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 403, Baker Street Fables. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Oh, the fabled Burt Wolder.
Yes, you know, my 7 little helpers were here only 10 minutes ago, but every so often they go off to the mine singing that little song. But yeah, that's me.
Excellent. Well, I was hoping to talk about, what was it, Hercules that had to clean out the Aegean fables?
Oh, that was yesterday.
Oh, Stables. It was Stables.
Oh, Stables.
Yeah. Well, we're anything but stable here. This is one of our Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes where we take a piece of old or new Sherlockian scholarship and we discuss it with you. We pick it apart, offer critiques, offer praise, etc., and tell you where you might find it. So, with that in mind, we are going to be talking about Remsen Ten Eyck Schenck's Baker Street Fables, which appeared in the Baker Street Journal, Volume 2, Number 2, from the new series from 1952. So, fasten your seatbelts because that is coming. In the meantime, just a reminder, if you'd like the show notes for this, just pop open the podcast app that you happen to be listening to us on, or check us out at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. There you'll find links to places we send you in this particular episode, as well as the ability to help us out on Patreon or on Substack. You pick which works for you. You can find us at patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. We do enter all of our supporters' names into a drawing at the end of every month, and that entitles the one lucky winner to receive a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. Just like we are going to a back issue of the Baker Street Journal for our reference here today. So, check that out, see what works for you. And while you're at it, if you wouldn't mind giving us a rating or a review, or both, on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, we'd appreciate your feedback and your input. It helps us make the show better and helps other people discover what the show is all about. Okay, Bert, you fabulist. You are a fabulous fabulist. How do you like that?
Well, I like that a lot. That's just fab.
We're the Fab 2.
Fab 2 minus 1. Fab 2 negative 3. Well, today we're going to be taking a really interesting look, and we're revisiting a Sherlockian writer whom we've touched on in the past, Remsen Ten Eyck Schenck. And I believe we most recently talked about one of his works on episode 377, The Effect of Trades on the Body. But I don't remember much about, maybe you remember more than I do, about this particular writer. I remember he was a researcher. He worked at Merck Research for a while. I believe he was a research chemist of some sort.
Either Merck or DuPont, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't. A noted fellow whose biography is not on the tip of my tongue, unfortunately.
Well, hey,
you remember
good,
anything about him?
good news for you. I think we have a quick mention of his bio in this very issue, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, good.
No, we don't. Sorry.
No, they weren't doing that.
Who Done It was an article by Edgar S. Rosenberger in this same volume. Well, my mistake.
Yes.
I'll have to go back and re-listen to episode 377 for our Remsen Ten Eyck Schenck biography.
Yes, but he's written in the Baker Street Journal New Series, Volume 2, Number 2, April 1952, a fascinating piece called Baker Street Fables, and he gets into the point of it immediately when he writes, one of the major absurdities of that inconsistent collection of traits known as human nature is the determination that heroes shall be heroic in all aspects. And the greater the man, as it turns out, the weirder the tale, like the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. And so what we're doing in this particular paper is taking a look at some of the outstanding characteristics of Sherlock Holmes under a critical lens, his skills in various areas, his knowledge, his ability. And it's a wonderful opportunity to take an investigative look and to question some of the things we take for granted.
Yeah, it's a fun exercise, actually, and you know, he gets right into it after having mentioned Washington and the cherry tree. He said Sherlock Holmes has been no exception. He was an extraordinarily versatile individual, but some of the accepted notions as to his powers are even further from the truth than the legends about Washington. And he said this confuses factual evidence on one hand and opinion on the other. And obviously, we know Holmes was a detective, a consulting detective. There's proof of that. That doesn't need the scientific manner for us to beat into people. We know he was an athlete. You know, we see examples of that throughout. Keen marksman. Of course, the VR on the wall tells us about that. A genius in disguising himself, wide knowledge of characteristics of footprints, tobacco ash, occupation of hands. All of these are connected with the art of detection. And he goes on to list some of the other things, being a lawyer, a good writer. These are, he said, these kind of creep into more of the opinion rather than the factual nature of some of the other aspects that we see. So when we try to put together which trait of Holmes is non-detective versus detective, the evidence begins to cloud our judgment. And so this is where he gets into his hypothesis about the conflicting evidence of what Holmes actually excelled at.
Yeah. The basic point here that he's making is terrific. If there is any conflicting evidence about Holmes's behavior that runs in contrary to this assessment of his abilities, it's even ignored or dismissed as Watson's mistake. And what about that? You know, for example, he says the arguments that Holmes was a competent chemist and an inspired violinist. Was he really? Well, let's review first the case for and against Holmes as a chemist. We've talked about his chemical table and his experiments a great deal over the years. From Stanford, we only know that he'd been a dresser before he was described as a great chemist, first-class chemist by Stanford. But Stanford is highly suspect because he's only known to Watson as a dresser under him when he was at Bart's. So how is it that we presume Stanford has a great knowledge of chemical talent? And very early in their acquaintance, Watson credited Holmes with a profound knowledge of chemistry. But later on, he misquotes himself as having said his chemistry knowledge actually was eccentric. And in any case, Watson, for all of his medical training, was no better judge of a chemist than Stanford was. To confuse the matter even further, we can't even be sure that any of the quotations intend the term chemist in the same sense as we understand it today, since in England it usually referred to as an apothecary.
Yeah, that's interesting that from these outside observers who really had no deep knowledge of chemistry other than what they may have encountered in medical school, was Holmes really a chemist? And he continues, he says, in the minds of Stanford and Watson then, obviously in his own as well, Holmes was a chemist. But if only as an avocation. So he says this isn't borne out by concrete evidence at our disposal. That blood test he was working on when Watson first walked in on him in the lab, he said the reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin and by nothing else. Watson reports that the solution assumed a dull mahogany color, then brownish dust was precipitated to the bottom. Well, this can be neither of the known methods of the detection of blood, since the outmoded Guaiac reaction gives a blue coloration and the usual benzodrine test a blue-green. Holmes's discovery would have certainly been in universal use today were it valid. The Sherlock Holmes test, remember that? And it must therefore be concluded that his belief in its specificity for hemoglobin was unfounded.
Yeah, and Holmes made even a greater error in estimating to Watson on that particular occasion the concentration of his blood solution. Holmes says 1 drop in a liter of water, Holmes says, cannot be a greater proportion than 1 in a million. Well, actually, says Schenck, it actually can't be less than 1 in 30,000.
Well, what's 970,000 atoms between a friend?
Yeah. And, of course, we never hear about the test ever again. So it's likely that Holmes just bitterly regretted he ever mentioned it, even to Watson. We never hear about it. And then, in the course of locating the missing Mordecai Smith and his launch Aurora, Holmes remarks that he returned his attention to the problem of the Sholtos when he had succeeded in dissolving the hydrocarbon which he was at work at. Well, here's Schenck, the chemist, saying, look, it's inconceivable that dissolving a hydrocarbon should be a problem even momentarily. To a chemist, Holmes might have said, when I had succeeded in tying my bootlace, because this is not triumphing over a great obstacle. And then when Holmes acts on behalf of Miss Mary Sutherland, his reply to Watson's query, well, have you solved it, was yes, it was the bisulfate of baryta. Well, perhaps he was answering Watson's intended question after all and not daydreaming over his chemical problem, since barium bisulfate doesn't exist. And it's as remote from chemistry as from the identity of the mysterious Hosmer angel. And then we get to his geological skills.
Which were just as impressive as his chemistry skills, I guess. When he looked at the blue carbuncle, remarking on all those crimes that were brought about for the sake of this 40-grain weight of crystallized charcoal, this is more than a poetic reference to an extraordinary gem. It's also an accurate and appropriate description in chemical terms for a large diamond. A carbuncle, however, was not the name for the diamond, but for the spinel, or ruby, which is composed of aluminum oxide. Holmes was probably misled by the derivation of carbuncle from the Latin carbunculus, meaning little amber, of fiery red glow. And it's usual that a carbuncle would glow red instead of blue. And he said, the mistake is understandable in the light of a classical education, but inexcusable in a chemist. How do you like that?
Yeah. Well, and then we go, Schenck continues with, see, here's where his chemistry background is providing a lot of fuel for him. He punctures the observation about Holmes's research into coal tar derivatives when he returns from the Reichenbach Falls, because so many organic compounds are coal tar derivatives. And then Holmes points out that Schenck points out that some of his technical assertions are really absurd. At some point, when he's waiting for the horse trainer to keep an appointment in one of the cases, in the Oshascom Old Place, he straightens up from his stooped position over a microscope and he cries, "It's glue, Watson! Unquestionably, it's glue! Those brown blobs in the center are undoubtedly glue." And then a few moments later, "Since I ran down that coiner by the zinc and copper filings in the seam of his cuff, they have begun to realize the importance of the microscope." Well, glue it might have been, but neither Holmes nor anyone else ever made the identification in such a way. And the same is true for zinc and copper, says Schenck. Holmes was right about the usefulness of the microscope, but it's limited to objects possessing a characteristic physical form like epithelial cells and threads from a tweed coat and so on. And it doesn't make any sense that the identification of glue could happen with that sort of physical visual observation. And then we're turning our attention to Holmes's talents as a musician. Certainly he had a lively and continuing interest in both vocal, or at any rate operatic and violin performances, and he might also have been enough of an expert on string instruments to confound Watson with his discussion of the advantages of Stradivarius versus Amati in violins and so on. But no such case could be made for Holmes as an inspired violinist, and his high opinion of his own virtuosity is apparent in his conversation with Watson as they first arranged to come to Baker Street. But it's unbelievable that any violinist, says Schenck, of any serious pretensions would be guilty of some of the things that Holmes subsequently does. Visualize, would Yasha Heifetz be lying about with his violin on the sofa? Or Yehudi Menuhin say, "Hand me my violin"? He would be more likely to brain you with a fire axe if you dare lay a finger on it. Or would he be flinging down his instrument? Or would he be scraping carelessly at the fiddle thrown across his knee like some Hawaiian guitarist?
Oh. So clearly this high opinion that Holmes has of his own virtuosity, this comes from that first conversation with Watson, and Watson blindly accepts this self-appraisal by Holmes in his usual uninformed, uncritical manner at its face value. And since he only notes a few weeks later that Holmes plays the violin well, it's unbelievable that any violinist of any serious pretensions would be guilty of some of those acts, as you say. And this kind of culminates to me, both the chemistry side and the music side. And I don't know if this was a clever ruse on Holmes's part or if it just happened to work out this way, where Holmes shared his expertise in these areas with which Watson was not familiar, or with which Watson was a Luddite. Right? So he could easily snow Watson about his virtuosity or about his ability as a chemist, and Watson would blindly accept it, just going along for the sake of, good heavens, Holmes, you astound me.
Well, it's wonderful that Schenck has taken this sort of critical, dispassionate view all the way back in 1952 about Holmes's abilities. He sums up by saying, "If you view all this dispassionately and just look at the evidence, instead of through your emotion, Sherlock Holmes emerges not as a great loss to physical science, but as a dabbler in chemistry on the small boy level, with his spasmodic puttering over an acid-scarred deal-top table littered with retorts, test tubes, and bottles of reagents. And he's not a potentially renowned concert violinist, but an ordinary music lover with the added ability to play simple airs on the violin. But the conclusion Henck gets us to is, surely he was great enough in his actual stature not to need trifling added endowments at the cost of branding Watson a falsifier in everything he wrote.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You come at a crisis, Watson. If this remains blue, all is well. If it turns red, it's a man's life.